Is World War III inevitable? Welcome to the General Podcast. This is a podcast series where we discuss issues and events happening around the world today so that students and everyone else can learn from them. I'm your host, Eunice.
And I'm your co-host, JH.
Today, we have a very, very special guest with us, and his name is Ruihan. Woo!
Welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thanks for coming onto the podcast. Maybe we can do a bit of a introduction, right? So Ruihan was actually a former student of mine, right? So Ruihan, please tell us a little bit more about your current status.
So, hi everyone, my name is Ruihan, and currently I'm a year one student majoring in business in the National University of Singapore.
Woo!
So, but you might be thinking, why does a business student talk to you about international politics today? So, with this, I actually have my credentials.
So in my free time, I'm actually an academic quiz player, and 2 years ago, I actually set up my own academic quiz club. And
I actually specialize in world history, geography, as well as world literature. So, I would love to believe that I'm more
Very
than
knowledgeable.
qualified in talking about this topic. And then also, prior to coming to NUS, actually, I was being accepted to 2 universities in Doha, Qatar.
one is Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, majoring in foreign service. And then afterwards,
But unfortunately, as I'm a broke year one NUS student, because obviously my family couldn't afford the $250,000 price tag. So that's why I'm here majoring in business, simply because it's more pragmatic, I believe.
All right, so very, very talented, very, very knowledgeable, but broke. That is your intro. Thanks, Ruihan, for coming on the podcast today, right? So what we're going to be talking about today is really the major, or rather the current wars and conflicts that are happening in today's world. As events are constantly unfolding, we will only be focusing on what we currently know. Okay, so whatever information that we share is going to be based on our opinions, our perspectives on what we have read thus far, or what we know about the conflicts and the implications, as well as the origins surrounding these conflicts. So the first one that we're going to be talking about is obviously the one that is currently in the front lines, or rather the foreground, okay, of our current climate, which is the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So maybe we can have Ruihan talk a little bit about the Russian-Ukraine conflict, specifically why, what happened that resulted in this Russian-Ukraine conflict.
Okay, so thank you, Miss Eunice. So basically, first thing I would like to clarify is that international politics actually isn't really that hard. Firstly, we need to understand that Russia actually really has a very expansionary nature since the start. Because if we actually do trace it back a long time ago, its first form that leads to modern Russia today is actually the Principality of Moscow. And it's being actually surrounded by Sweden and Poland, Lithuania. And don't look at both countries today as small compared to Russia today, but back in the 16th century, they're actually very powerful. So Russia's first form, which is the Principality of Moscow, actually couldn't really expand west. So instead, they actually targeted eastwards instead, towards all the Turkic Khanates that obviously are no match for the Principality of Moscow. So that's how they actually really started their expansionary nature. So the second thing we definitely need to talk about as well is the geopolitical troubles that Russia today is actually facing. So as we know, Russia is actually situated on this thing called the Northern European Plain, is flat land. And obviously, you really don't want your country to be on flat land in times of war. This Northern European Plain actually extends from modern-day Netherlands to the Ural Mountains in Russia. And it's like a funnel. And obviously, because it's like a funnel, if you are the Russian government, you wouldn't want the front line to be within your country, because that means it's a longer front line and it's very hard to defend. And in fact, we also need to talk about how Moscow actually had battles 3 times. The first time was a victory for Russia against Poland, Lithuania, 1612 Battle of Moscow. And then afterwards, 2 centuries later, we have the Napoleonic Wars, Battle of Borodino, in which Russia lost heavily to France. And then the most recent one is, of course, the incursions by Nazi Germany from 1942 to 43 in terms of Operation Barbarossa. And in that, we actually really see Nazi Germany really getting really, really close to Moscow. The closest they were actually just a mere 12 kilometers away from Moscow. So obviously, it is definitely in Russia's interest to really defend its national borders since it's so vulnerable. And therefore, especially after World War II, they're actually really big on the Warsaw Pact. So this Warsaw Pact is actually a military alliance of socialist states. East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Hungary, and Bulgaria, quite a few more actually. But Albania actually notably withdrew in 1968, but that's for another day. But this Warsaw Pact is actually not just a simple alliance to back then the Soviet Union. It was more of a buffer zone, if you realize. It forms a buffer zone away from the US-led NATO. So that is why the Warsaw Pact was founded in the first place.
Let's talk a little bit about NATO as well, like what exactly it is basically, right?
So NATO actually stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but in French they call it OTAN. I don't know why. So
Fun facts we didn't even
Fun
know.
facts.
so basically, what about NATO is that NATO is simply put is a military alliance of what we call the free world. And basically with NATO, like NATO is very elusive these days, especially because of its Article 5. Because Article 5 of NATO actually states that if a member state gets invaded, all the other countries within NATO will have to defend this member state because it is akin to a invasion of all the other member states. That's what makes NATO so elusive in the first place. But simply put, NATO, this in modern context is actually more of a historical baggage. It is something that should have been disbanded technically, but obviously due to US and the European world's interest, it wasn't disbanded.
Is that also like the reason why Ukraine really wanted to join NATO as well, right? Because of the
Definitely
whole-
is. It's just that elusive. And actually, speaking about NATO, NATO is actually definitely one of the reasons why this war actually broke out. It must be noted that NATO is a top rule breaker. So NATO actually promised to Russia that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union on auspicious Christmas Day 1991, that we promised to you that we won't expand eastwards. But they only kept the promise for 3 years. And then afterwards, they started their first round of expansion. And till date, there are actually 5 rounds of eastern expansion, which actually moved the NATO front line 1,000 kilometers east. So these days, NATO actually already is creeping on Russia's borders, like Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Slovakia, Hungary, and even Romania. And the only countries in Europe that are generally not inside is like Finland. And then within the former Soviet Union, we have Moldova, Ukraine, and Belarus. And it must be noted that Russia and Belarus, along with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, as well as Armenia, they're also in this thing called Collective Security Treaty Organization. So I don't know if I can say that it is completely opposing. I wouldn't say so, but definitely NATO actually does threaten CSTO interests, defensive interests as well. So basically, there's a historical national identity of expansion. There's NATO. And there's also like the weaknesses of Russia. So if Ukraine actually does join NATO, it will definitely be a national defense disaster because NATO would certainly almost fully surround Russia and Belarus.
There is also this particular situation where Russia took over Crimea, right? And it's because of the resources that are involved.
So we have to say that Crimea is a region of definite interest because if you look at the map, you see the diamond-shaped Crimea. It is basically located in the Black Sea. And it actually hosts a lot of Black Sea ports like Sevastopol, Yalta, Simferopol. These were all very strategic ports anyway. But the most important thing about Crimea is that Crimea actually didn't really belong to Ukraine in the first place. The reason is because like during the Soviet Union era, so like the USSR was actually split into 15 republics. So of which one was a Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, that is Russia. The other 14 are just ordinary Soviet Socialist Republics, SSRs. So what happened was that Crimea actually belonged to the Russian SFSR all the way until 1954, when the General Secretary at the time was Khrushchev, decided to give it to Ukraine to celebrate some 300th anniversary of something that I couldn't really recall. But obviously that was just a pretext of why he decided to give it away in the first place. But the real reason was because Khrushchev was actually conducting de-Stalinization, and all the SSRs, or rather most of the SSRs, actually suffered greatly under Stalin, which, you know, like there's a lot of deportation of Chechens, deportation of Ingush, and in Ukraine there was the Holodomor of like 1931 to 32. Basically,
What are those? We have to interject. Please let us know. Those are referring to the minorities.
those
right?
are to the minorities,
Yeah.
and the Holodomor is basically a government-induced famine
Okay.
that resulted in Ukraine. So obviously, back then they weren't having the best internal relations. So obviously, Khrushchev wanted to ease things out, and he just gives it Crimea. But as we are saying, Crimea is actually very strategic. When Russia actually went into Crimea, it was actually a response towards what was happening internally in Ukraine, because Ukraine back in 2014 actually underwent the Maidan Revolution, or we call it Euromaidan actually, because it's a pro-EU thing. So the Maidan Revolution actually wanted to oust then President Viktor Yanukovych, who is arguably a pro-Russian president. So what happened was that the Maidan Revolution actually overthrew Yanukovych, and Russia obviously wasn't happy with it because its ally was being, or rather in less comfortable terms like puppet, was being ousted from the presidency. So they actually responded by annexing Crimea. The reason why they wanted to annex Crimea is actually also partly because of oil. So they actually found that there were a lot of cubic meters, millions of cubic meters of oil in the Black Sea Special Economic Zone. And this was a very enticing incentive to invade Crimea, because by getting control of this Black Sea SEZ, they would be able to actually prevent Ukraine from being like the Europe's second largest
Oil supply, because
correct.
Russia is currently the one that's mainly in the lead, right?
Yes.
So in other words, Ukraine would threaten their position at that point in time.
Yes, that's correct. And actually, there were a lot of pipelines flowing through Ukraine. And obviously, Ukraine actually leveraged on it by charging like millions of dollars of tariffs on Russia. So obviously, Russia, due to economic interest, decided to take Crimea so that they have this control of this SEZ. And with the SEZ actually containing 80% of Ukraine's oil and natural gas reserves, if Ukraine actually controlled it, it will be a very huge leverage to join the EU and be Europeanized. And that is something that Russia really doesn't want to see. But speaking about Europeanization, it was also quite interesting how Russia initially wanted to join NATO, like the NATO under Yeltsin, and initially under Putin. They really wanted to be part of this like European community. But it's just that NATO and US really never saw them as allies in the first place. They perceive it as impossible. So what happened is that Putin, after he became more experienced, realized that this is not going to work out. And so therefore he became more...
Take care of his own personal and national interests.
Correct. He became more concerned with defending himself. So that is the economic reason. And also that once they annexed Crimea, Ukraine actually cut off the water supply in the northern Crimean Canal. And this has resulted in certain environmental crises such as drought. It is said that 2020 is actually the worst year for Crimea in terms of drought. So there is definitely an environmental reason in terms of why Russia wanted to invade Ukraine.
There have been opinions as well, on the ground sentiments, where people often say that, oh, this is not Russia. Russia didn't support the war. It's actually Putin's war. So what would you have to say about, the difference between what the people are thinking and what the government or Putin is thinking of?
So for me, my personal opinion is that definitely that's true. The ground sentiment really doesn't reflect the governmental sentiment, as is true in many countries. In this case, it's very true, especially because many Russians actually do have family in Ukraine. After all, they are very related groups. Like they're all belonging to the Eastern Slavic group, along with the Belarusians. So it is natural for Russians to have family in Ukraine and vice versa. So that explains why people are very against the war. And the worst part that came afterwards was the sanctions.
Yes.
And as we know, in so many cases, sanctions never affect the top, they only affect the bottom. So that is also another very practical reason as to why people were really against the war in the first place.
Let's talk a little bit about the response of other countries. Okay, so in terms of China, right, I would say they have been quite neutral in their response. Okay, so what are your thoughts about that?
So China's neutral response is definitely very understandable because China actually really has I would say it's a relatively close working relationship with Russia. China is actually really, personal opinions, that is really, really being very tactful about this because it also has its own internal security problems and external problems, maybe in the form of Taiwan or even in like the alleged separatist region of Xinjiang with the Xinjiang Uyghurs. So definitely like its neutral stance is very, very understandable.
On that note as well, I mean, what we're also leading into is about how our own country responds to that as well. So we are one of those few countries, I would say, within Southeast Asia that openly condemns the invasion in itself. It's really mainly because of this stance that about maintaining your own independence, about your own sovereignty. So would you feel that like there might be other underlying reasons to that as well?
That's a great question. Okay, if there is an underlying reason as to why Singapore went against Russia, I would say that it is in part due to its in a way what I perceive as a follower foreign policy. Because the truth is that the US obviously will condemn it. And China this time maintains neutrality. So obviously like Singapore will look at both foreign powers and be like, I think it's okay to condemn. And like what you said, sovereignty is definitely also an issue. So it's like a respect for sovereignty.
Okay, maybe I can add on here. So I've been to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Singapore, the Singapore website. Okay, so the fact sheet mentioned, one of the few things that they have done. Okay, firstly, financial institutions in Singapore will be prohibited from the following: entering into transaction or establishing business relationships with the following Russian banks. So they list a few. And there are others as well, providing financial services to designated Russian non-bank entities. Okay, so all these are currently the steps outlined to show that they are not for this war. So all in all, what do you think about this Ukraine-Russian conflict? Do you think that it is justified that this war actually happened, given all the origins, and how it came to be?
Okay, so on this question, right, I would not say that it's justified, but I would say that it's expected because of already the signs of escalations for like the past 8 years. There will be an outburst given all the factors combined, especially with the 5 eastern expansions of NATO. That is really, really, really the top of the list concern. But for whether it's justified, I would definitely just give a simple answer. It's not justified. Simply because it violates international law. It's just like, example, I actually also like expressed my stance in another war, also concerning international law. And that actually only happened in 2020, during September 2020. I don't know why they would fight a war in the middle of the COVID pandemic. But we have Armenia versus Azerbaijan fighting the second Nagorno-Karabakh war. And in terms of this, I actually supported Azerbaijan because by international law, Nagorno-Karabakh belongs to Azerbaijan. And that is why I expressed my support. And in that war, there are also other factors such as like how Nikol Pashinyan wanted to, which is the Armenian Prime Minister, happened to be the chair for the earlier mentioned CSTO in 2022 as well. He wanted to solidify his legitimacy amongst the Armenian people and be like, hey, let's go and expand Nagorno-Karabakh. Other people will support me. But you need to remember, as a leader, that this war can always be a double-edged sword. If done well, it can boost legitimacy. But if you lost the war like Armenia did, you will face protests and people telling you to resign. So basically, short answer is the invasion of Ukraine is illegal by international law.
Okay. What about you, JH? What do you think?
I mean, it's always a very touchy topic, right? And actually, this whole conflict, I've been following daily updates about Russia and Ukraine from Reddit mainly. So in terms of this question of like whether war is justifiable, it's a straight up no from me based on the basis of the cost of human lives. So in terms of like what I've been viewing on Reddit, a lot of the videos that are coming in from Ukraine are also going viral from that standpoint as well, which is because like houses are being bombed, hospitals were being even like destroyed by rockets as well. And even at one point in time, there were threats of a meltdown of a nuclear plant because Russia was constantly bombarding them. So for me, these are the kinds of things that I consume. These are the types of contents that I see. And it's just really upsetting to kind of like be constantly bombarded with all these sorts of information, and it really makes you think about like, okay, whether any sort of ideology, does it justify overall that cost of human lives? So for me, the answer is a straight up no.
On the note about like social media as well, how a lot of the people who are witnessing what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, it's based on a lot on the media portrayal of this conflict. And it also raises this issue of why is it that, you know, when it comes to other wars that's happening or other conflicts that's happening right now, because it's not just Russia and Ukraine that's facing this conflict. We have the Syrian War that has been ongoing for more than a decade already, and it's been put in the background, right? Why is it that the media portrayal of this conflict appears to be disproportionate to the other kinds of conflicts that we have out here, right? So what do you think about that?
So I would just be very straight up and say that I believe that this is hypocrisy of the general folk. And it's something that I believe that to a certain extent I'm not absolved from as well. And basically we need to understand that we're actually living in a unipolar world. It's not a bipolar world like during the Cold War. It is a unipolar world with US as the so-called superpower. And a lot of spotlight is actually going on US and Europe. So it also becomes very Eurocentric. And it's actually definitely an expectancy violation when you see like a European country get invaded, since like all the news you've been consuming is so Eurocentric. And again, we also need to go back to the issue of white privilege, which has been very conveniently slaughtered under the table. But yes, white privilege does exist today in all fields. Even in like Singapore, it does exist as well. So that's probably the reason why people are actually shocked that Ukraine is facing this kind of invasion and whatnot. But personally, I would say that it's not all that surprising because prior to the war, Ukraine is also not that developed. It is still developing. In fact, it has been ranked the poorest country in Europe. Please don't kill me, Ukrainians. So what happened is that it has been ranked the poorest country of Europe. It has rampant corruption, even until probably today, even though I would argue that it has probably gotten slightly better under Zelensky. But at least what I know is that prior to Poroshenko, the government is just downright corrupt. That's why people have gone sick of it and they decided to vote a comedian in as a president. So basically, that's my take on that question.
Just one more note on that as well. It was quite interesting that you mentioned about how there's this inherent bias towards like Western consumption media, right? So one point that I did note as well was that, yeah, even on my own standpoint, I mean, I do realize as well that the type of content that I am consuming about the Russian-Ukraine war is largely pro-Ukrainian. Yeah, most of the time, it's always very skewed towards that side, and hardly you'll ever hear like news coming in from the Russian side, or rather like if there are any news that are, let's say, on any of these sorts of Western social media platforms. I mean, you can't deny that, right? Like Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they're all Western based. So any news that comes in that is largely from the Russian side, will be very heavily scrutinized. So there was also one more thing you mentioned about Eurocentrism, which I thought was pretty interesting because majority of its social media users, like by its citizens, they also do utilize like these Western social media platforms. Whereas for the other countries, they have their own alternative platforms, which perhaps then it means that they aren't able to get the word out as much as let's say this current ongoing conflict. So yeah, I did think that was one interesting to note too.
On that note as well, I've read certain articles that mention like when China demonstrates their neutrality, when they are neutral, right, even though they're neutral, they're still slanted a little bit towards Russia. Okay, so like even their media, right, they'll try not to have any anti-Russian kind of news, right? So any dissidents out there that is against this whole conflict, right, they will try to kind of dumb down the controversy or the supposed piece of news. So that's something that is interesting on the other side because we don't really expose ourselves much to what's happening in China, right? So I think that time you were also mentioning to me, Ruihan, previously that you actually went there on a visit to the place and then you had some insights about it as well. So maybe you can give a bit of background information about this whole situation between what's happening, with China and Xinjiang.
So yes, it is true what Miss Eunice said. I went to Xinjiang when I was a 19-year-old kid, I would say.
Very brief. I wouldn't dare.
I went alone into Xinjiang. I actually started from Chongqing. I went to Lanzhou, and in Xinjiang proper, I went to Hami. Yeah, where your Hami melons come from. But sadly, it was winter. There wasn't any. And then afterwards, I went to Turpan, again, where some of your grapes come from. But sadly, there wasn't any again. And then I went to the regional capital of Urumqi. So that took me about 11 days. But I definitely learned a lot from my trip. Obviously, like we need to talk about the motivations as to why I made this trip. Because firstly, I'm very interested in Uyghur culture. Second thing, I wanted to actually understand more about the situation there. So these are the deeper reasons. The superficial reasons is more like because I've heard of the famed beauty of the Uyghur opposite gender from television portrayals. So I just wanted to see if that is true. And long story short, it's true. So anyway, when I went there, the security situation was obviously much tighter. It's definitely a good thing in terms of security because police are actually required to arrive within 2 to 3 minutes. There's a lot of CCTV coverage, even in hotels. So that makes like arrest of robbery very, very fast. Sometimes there are incidents where the car suffered like a theft, but the owner doesn't know about it. It's not because he's sleeping. It's because by the time he arrives, the criminal has been taken away.
Very, very efficient.
Very efficient. And it is alleged that police stations are actually always within a 200-meter radius of where you are. So that's what I know. So I would say security is definitely very safe at all major places, especially train stations. And also shopping malls. There's actually a lot of security.
So this hyper surveillance, right? Have you ever felt like, okay, physically safe, yes, but have you ever felt like, being watched and then you really have to be very careful with every move that you make?
I would definitely say that because Xinjiang is a political sensitive region, then there's a lot of this hyper surveillance. I mean, it's good for me as a tourist because I'm not living there. I go there like for only 11 days and I feel safe. But for the people, there's a deeper level of consideration, like being like watched like every time. That is main concern, and like even like personal data, because as we know, China actually doesn't really give too much of a damn about personal data. When I was in Hami at the train station, they actually have these improvised metal gates for you to go through, and there's a screen above the metal gates that will literally flash the person's personal data, NIC. I mean, their version of that NIC, their date of birth, that kind of thing, even their photo, which I felt was quite pervasive. So that's definitely something to consider about. And obviously, I would encourage people to go to Xinjiang because it's really not as dangerous as the media portrays it. This is not 1980s, this is 2021 or 2022. But other than that, I think going to the region actually left me more confused than before I went there. Because the thing is that I actually felt sadder about the cultural genocide. Like say when I was in Hami, I actually observed that certain buildings, like because by law, right, all minority areas, right, of China, especially autonomous regions, they need to put the Mandarin form as well as the local language.
Yes.
That has been allocated. So in case of Xinjiang, Uyghur is definitely the Uyghur language. But it's very sad that in certain buildings, certain signages, the Uyghur language is alleged to be disappearing. And it's just Han Chinese all the way. Even though I never personally really observed it, partly because I was only in Hami for 1 day. I went to Turpan for 3 days. And Turpan was more of a 70% Uyghur, 30% Han Chinese. So therefore, they can't remove the minority language.
Because that's the majority there.
That's a majority in that particular city. But it's still really, really saddening to see. And when I was in Hami, I actually heard a personal anecdote of like how there was a woman who actually wanted to marry her fiancé. But just before the marriage, her fiancé just got seized by the Chinese authorities and was dutifully re-educated for 3 years plus.
3 years plus.
The word is plus because it might be still continuing. So you never know when your loved one is going to come out. The state won't tell you. So I think that in itself is very sad. It's just that a lot of people, when they discuss this issue, I feel that they don't really discuss this issue with sensitivity. The first thing they go out is, what do you think about the Uyghur genocide? And the first thing that come out is genocide. And then they start to be like, okay, we have this picture from BBC that shows Uyghur prisoners. We got this. What is your opinion? As if they want to force you to say, yes, I fully agree with the fact. But for me, I tend to take a more careful approach because I don't think we need to jump few steps to talk about the possibility of genocide or the alleged torture methods. The fact that people are being taken away for re-education from their loved ones without notice, I think is definitely in itself a tragedy.
True.
So that's why.
There's also this media portrayal that I was looking at with regard to this situation was that, like all the Western media, they have been portraying these education camps as a place that is full of misery, suffering, because they're trying to, rid the Uyghurs of their culture. But at the same time, I have also seen this particular video from the Chinese media where they show people actually, like the officials, right, actually going to these people's homes and trying to convince them to go for these camps. So instead of it being looked like it was they were forcibly taken away, it was portrayed as like more of like a persuasion of sorts, like trying to convince them to go for it. And there were certain incentives, like if you go for this re-education camps, right, we will give you jobs, you would be moved to another province, and you would have better opportunities and all that. So personally, when I saw that, I am a little bit torn because I don't know which side is true. Right, maybe half, maybe there are a bit of truth in what the Western media is portraying, and then there is a bit of truth as well in what the Chinese media has been portraying. But you never really know because we are all really just bystanders. We are outsiders. We are not within the situation itself, right? We can only look at it from outsiders' lens. So on that note about the fact that there are certain less covered conflicts, right? Let's talk about perhaps one other conflict that's currently ongoing right now, which I kind of briefly mentioned earlier on, which is the Syrian War. So Syrian War has been ongoing for more than a decade. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how it came about and what is going on right now, because I heard that there's a lot of parties involved in this whole conflict.
The Syrian Civil War is basically like a Taiwanese drama. Because you start off with the first few actors. And then when it reaches episode 100, the set of actors change. And it's also same for the Syrian Civil War. It started off with a certain set of actors like the Syrian government, the Syrian opposition, and then you got ISIS up there being active all the way until about 2015 when they got massively whacked. And therefore you have the fourth actor, which is the Kurds. So these Kurds actually managed to kick ISIS back to where they are supposed to belong, which is never.
So they never belonged. Okay.
So it has really evolved a lot. So these days we still have the Syrian government. We have the Syrian opposition. But the Syrian opposition these days has found itself a new ally, which is not entirely unexpected. And that new ally is in the form of Turkey, and I'll go into that more later. And then afterwards we have the Rojava. Rojava is the Kurd-led northeastern Syrian organization. And obviously because it's also democratic in this place called the Middle East, the US supports Rojava. I won't comment on that. But we will comment on more pressing issues such as how Turkey decides to support the Syrian opposition. And we also need to understand why Turkey supports it. So the current leader is, of course, we know is the person who caused the wonderful Turkish hyperinflation in the form of Erdogan. And Erdogan is a conservative, and his party, which is, for information, known as the AK Party, actually propagates this ideology called Neo-Ottomanism. So this is a concept that needs to be explained, but if you split the word up, Neo and Ottomanism, they basically want to revive the glory of the old Ottoman Empire that has lasted from 1299 to 1923. The way they do it is they intervene in countries that were once part of the Ottoman Empire, probably like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, and even all the way down to Sudan and certain African countries. This is why we see Turkey as a very active player in terms of like cooperation with Africa, cooperation with the Middle East. Is actually being fueled by Neo-Ottomanism. And speaking about the Syrian Civil War, I will also have to add that Syria itself is an artificial construct. From a modern Republican perspective, Syria itself is an artificial construct. Because the former fate of Syria was actually previously at least two Ottoman vilayets. For people who don't understand what vilayets are, vilayets just treat them as provinces. Yeah. So we have the province of Damascus, as well as the province of Aleppo. That is basically the main constituent of Syria. And how did Syria even come into existence? Very interesting. So basically, the unfortunate Ottoman Empire segment of Europe participated in World War I. They allied with Germany, they lost. And once they lost, you have all the Western powers eyeing on the Ottoman Empire because they're just like, Wonderful resources waiting for us.
Waiting for the pie to be sliced.
Waiting for the pie to be sliced. So what happens is that they actually went in, and if you do study the Ottoman partition, it is basically tragic because the initial partition was literally the Greeks, the Armenians, even the Italians had a part in this, the French, and the Brits, of course. So what happened was that the Brits and the French actually drew the Sykes-Picot line that is, if you see, is the modern day border between Iraq and Syria. It's unusually straight. That is the main problem. And therefore, with this unusually straight border, I would say that's definitely what resulted in the further complications in the Syrian Civil War. And obviously the ISIS insurgency that was part of it. Because the border itself is not a natural border and it's very poorly guarded. So therefore, it actually gave ISIS a lot of room to actually form this so-called caliphate between both countries. But the more concerning part is that with this line, you actually complicate a lot of things, such as the people, especially the people. You are actually dividing people of the same belief on both sides, because Islam is actually more complicated than you would think.
All right, so given all these conflicts, ongoing conflicts and wars that are happening in today's world, right, what do you think would be considered as the primary motivations of these conflicts?
I think the first thing definitely needs to be to do with culture and identity. Like how the world powers and even the numerous countries around our world interact with each other, what kind of historical amnesty there is. I think that's definitely a very huge defining factor. Second thing, it will be resources. And the third thing will be definitely more of, in some cases, political legitimacy. So obviously one very classic example will be how Saddam Hussein sent his army to fight left and right and invade Kuwait, because his primary motivation is very simple, is that he doesn't want the army to oppose him, and he wants to keep them very occupied so that they will never think of ever opposing him or overthrowing him. But sadly, that strategy ultimately worked against him in the good old year of 2004 to 2006 when he was captured by the US. So again, it's a double-edged sword to play with.
Let's kind of bring it back to Singapore context. Let's talk about, let's say, if Singapore is under siege, all right, we are under attack. Given our current volatile situation, right, in the world today, would you actually consider staying for the country? Would you consider to stay on and fight for the country, or would you leave? Because if we take a look at what happened in Ukraine, right? Even though Ruihan, you mentioned that it was inevitable, but I think many people on the ground as well, the citizens, right? They always hope that this kind of things would happen. Nobody wishes for war, but when this happens, right, that it took the entire world, or at least for us, right, by surprise. Okay, so let's say Singapore, right? The chances of us being attacked, it might seem like it's not going to happen, but what if it happens, right? Would you actually stay to protect the country?
I would say that I'm not all that nationalistic, not all that patriotic, because I would argue that Ukraine is a very different country from Singapore. So we need to first establish that Ukraine does have a certain culture that has been consolidated. It does have a certain national identity. Whereas for us, it's more is a rojak, we call it. And the culture hasn't really been consolidated. Haters can hate me for it, but I feel that's the truth. But basically, we are not that consolidated. So I believe that certain people will say, yeah, faster run lah. But for me, I don't think I have a choice. Or maybe I do. So it really depends on the situation on the ground that makes me do you want to run? Or maybe I want to run. Maybe I want to run, but maybe not at the moment. But definitely no one wants to become a refugee, because everyone surrounding us is not very friendly, with the exception of Brunei, which is one flight away. But in wars, how many flights are there?
That is true.
For me, I think of it from a very pessimistic standpoint. That back then when Singapore first fell during World War II, it was within the span of 3 days to a week, I think, when we fell to the Japanese. So from that standpoint as well, it also makes me think about with our small land size, with our small tiny land mass, how much of it can we really defend? And should I then be the one to go on ground and be to in Singaporean terms, we call it chiong sua, which means to charge at the mountain, which to be the first one to die, in other words, right? But then again, how would life be like as a refugee? Earlier on, when you were mentioning it, it got me thinking a bit. I'll be but realistically speaking, I stay on the far end away from the airport. So I guess before I could even make it to the airport, I'll probably be already conscripted and welcomed by the army to go in. That's really speaking though. But what about you, Eunice? Would you fight for our nation?
I think I would stay, But the reason why I choose to stay is not so much driven by the fact that I am so ever so proud to be a Singaporean, but more of the fact that I don't see where else I can be. Because I think I think we are all very privileged. I enjoy my comforts in Singapore, and I cannot imagine myself being a refugee living in another country as a second-class citizen. And it's not fun, obviously. There's no fun in that. You're going to constantly be in need of basic necessities. And I cannot imagine myself constantly having to worry about things that I never had to worry about just because I chose to escape from my country. And it goes back as well to this point that I was thinking about. In Singapore, we are not exactly full of natural resources, right? A lot of the motivations or the primary motivations for why there are invasions or conflicts is because of natural resources. And Singapore does not have any natural resources, which I guess that is why we aren't very appealing, right, when it comes to invasion. But one thing that we have is definitely our infrastructure. So I think that if there is a foreign nation or a foreign country, right, that take an interest to our country, it would be our infrastructure and not so much of our people. Because look at us. Okay, we're like, I don't know, we're very, in general, I think we really very fortunate. And we are so fortunate to the fact that we probably would not be able to survive without our comforts. That's the harsh reality and that's the truth lah. And probably what they would do is they would smoke out all the citizens and all the Singaporeans and then take over our infrastructure. Right, so I'm not going to let them have their way, okay? I'd rather die here. So this is my belief lah. Anyway, right now, if we were to imagine warfare, right, at this current standpoint, I mean, yes, there are troops that have to be at the front lines, but I don't think all of them will be. I think that a lot of the nature of warfare is no longer just physical, front line, face-to-face. It's also about technological warfare. It's media is also involved as well. So there are so many aspects to warfare in modern times that I believe each and every one of us will probably have potential to shine. That's all I can think about. That's all I can say, right? I mean, not everyone can fight physically, and I don't think we are all adequately trained. And Singapore's so small, okay, right? If you talk about being strategic, right, you're going to send 80% of your human population to the front lines. Obliterate already. What's Singapore? Singapore no more already, okay? Right? The government or the nation were to be strategic, right? No lah. They probably wouldn't put so many people on the front lines also. Moving on to our next segment, Would You Rather? But first, let's drink. Woo! Cheers! Okay, alright, so we only have one question for the day. Back to the point where if the situation of Singapore being attacked, right, would you actually stay on? So let's say if you choose not to stay on, right, and you get a free pass to go to any country, okay, any country, you're not a refugee, but you have the opportunity to go to another country and basically restart your life. Which country would you pick? Maybe you can start first, Mr. Ruihan.
I will do a complete reset of my life by basically just really not attaching to any country. Because in a way, I like to live
a nomad, right? That's the idea.
A nomadic lifestyle.
Interesting.
As a joke, maybe I draw from my Mongolic ancestors.
Ooh.
But
very exotic.
Mongolic, not Mongolic. But nomadic lifestyle to me is in a way it's a dream basically. Because I actually do have a dream. That's why I solo travel a lot, which is to travel to every country in the world. Because I'm a person who really likes to understand different cultures and I don't like the concept of settling down. So I feel constricted that way.
I see. Okay. How about you, JH?
I can't really think of a specific country at this moment, but in terms of the considerations that I'll look out for, I would think that if, let's say, our country ever turns into shambles and we really need to get out of the country, I would actually want a safe country, not for me, regardless of whether I'll be treated as a second-class citizen or not. But if I'm taking family members along, let's say if I do happen to have children, I would want to look for a country that's able to kind of accept them unconditionally. More specifically, I'm thinking along the lines of probably somewhere Finland or Sweden. Yeah, probably somewhere in the Nordic countries where generally it's a lot safer for migration in a sense.
I think you mentioned something very interesting, migration. So when I consider this question as well, right, I think to myself, not from a standpoint of if my country were to suddenly disappear from the face of the world map, okay, but more of perhaps I reshape the question to think about, let's say if I were to retire, where would I want to go? Okay, and I already have the answer to that already. I'll go either Australia or Canada. Thank you very much. Right? Hi. All right. If I can have a citizenship there, a second citizenship, but I don't think Singapore allows for that, right?
No, they don't.
Yeah, so sad. Well, okay. Settle for that as a hypothetical scenario for now. from what I see, I think Australia is a place where, I mean, if I were to think from a standpoint, like if I were to go to university, right, and I want to go to an overseas university, UK universities are great because their qualifications, the certs that you get there is like prestigious, established and all that. Australia is usually the one that people also consider as overseas. I know, Ruihan, yours is a bit more exquisite, okay? Right, you have fine tastes, right, at Doha. But the more, like, you know, the more basic, the more basic youth, right, would think about these countries. And I think like there are reasons why, right? Really because they are more accepting in terms of like allowing people to go there to receive an education. There are people that I know who settle in Australia and Canada as well, and they are living fairly decent lives there. So yeah, I mean, if I were to choose, I would go there.
I would just want to add that probably some people just go to Australia because pragmatic reason being like there's lesser emphasis on grades. So people go there to, without any better word, they go there to mess around, lead a party
Slack.
lifestyle. Go study the day, party in the Cosmopolitan, like probably at Melbourne at night. So that is probably one of the reasons.
So
True,
GC
true.
students, if you're listening to this right now, you know,
Yeah,
that's
going
one sort of
overseas.
opinion about going overseas to university.
But the cost of living is quite high. All right, thank you so much for tuning in and listening in on our podcast.
Right, please like and subscribe to our socials, as well as leave in the comments down below if you can consider as well where would you like to go if you had a free pass anywhere in the world. All right, till next time, we'll see you then.
Bye.